Power is a dangerous drug, and Officer Mateo Hayes was addicted. With a badge on his chest and a badge of hatred in his heart, he made it his mission to bully the undesirables of Houston. But in a quiet corner of a local coffee shop, he picked the wrong man to intimidate. He thought he was dealing with an easy target. Instead, he walked straight into a federal investigation. This is the story of a tyrant's spectacular fall and the absolute justice that followed. Houston, Texas in mid-August is less of a city and more of a convection oven. The heat doesn't just warm you, it suffocates you, pressing down on your chest the second you step out of air conditioning. For Lucas Hayes, the oppressive humidity was normally a nuisance, but today it matched his mood perfectly. Heavy, exhausting, and relentless. Lucas was a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically attached to the Houston Field Office's Public Corruption and Civil Rights Task Force. For the last 2 weeks, he had been working a grueling, undercover joint agency operation down in Galveston. The assignment had required him to look the part of a down-on-his-luck dock worker. He had spent 14 days wearing the same 3 faded, sweat-stained t-shirts, a pair of scuffed steel-toed boots, and loose, frayed cargo pants. He hadn't shaved in a week and a half, leaving a thick, patchy salt and pepper beard that obscured his usually sharp jawline. At 42 years old, Lucas was a man who commanded respect in a suit, but in his current attire, he was virtually invisible to high society and a magnet for unwarranted suspicion everywhere else. It was 7:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. The operation had officially wrapped at 3 a.m., and Lucas had driven straight up the 45 back to Houston, entirely running on fumes. Before heading to his apartment in the Heights to crash for the next 24 hours, he needed caffeine. Not the watered-down break-room sludge at the bureau, but real, dark, roasted coffee. He pulled his unmarked, subtly dented Chevy Tahoe into the parking lot of the Grind and Press, an upscale, independent coffee shop nestled on the border of the affluent River Oaks neighborhood. It was the kind of place that charged $7 for an espresso and was constantly filled with men in tailored Brioni suits and women in Lululemon athletic wear clutching designer handbags. Lucas pushed through the heavy glass door, the blast of the shop's aggressive air conditioning hitting his face like a physical wall. The bell above the door chimed softly. He dragged his heavy boots across the polished concrete floor, keeping his head down. He ordered a large black drip coffee from a bright-eyed, 20-something barista named Chloe, paid with a crumpled $20 bill, and dropped his change into the tip jar. Taking his steaming cup, Lucas retreated to the farthest corner of the café. He slid into a leather booth, let out a long, ragged exhale, and opened his laptop to send a final, unclassified, all-secure email to his unit chief. He just wanted 20 minutes of peace, 20 minutes of quiet air conditioning before he went home to sleep. 10 minutes later, the chime above the door rang again, sharper this time. Officer Mateo Hayes walked into the Grind and Press like he owned the building. Hayes was a 12-year veteran of the Houston Police Department, a man who had let a badge and a gun inflate his ego to dangerous proportions. He was built like a fire hydrant, stocky, wide-shouldered, with a tightly buzzed haircut and a permanently ruddy complexion that suggested he was always running just a little too hot. Hayes had a reputation in the precinct. He was a stats guy, the kind of cop who aggressively hunted for low-level busts to pad his numbers, often operating in affluent neighborhoods where the wealthy residents praised his proactive policing. But behind closed doors, Hayes had a thick file with internal affairs, use of force complaints, harassment allegations, and multiple accusations of racial profiling. Each time the police union had fought tooth and nail to keep him on the streets, burying the complaints in bureaucratic red tape. Hayes strutted to the counter, bypassing a line of 3 people. The patrons, mostly young professionals and affluent retirees, simply stepped aside, offering tight, uncomfortable smiles. Hayes ordered his usual, a large iced caramel macchiato, entirely free of charge, a courtesy the shop owner provided to on-duty officers to keep them around as a visible deterrent. As Hayes leaned against the counter, waiting for his sugar-loaded drink, his pale blue eyes scanned the room. He was looking for anomalies. In his mind, he was a sheepdog protecting the flock. His eyes swept past the businessmen reading the Wall Street Journal. They skipped over the 2 college girls giggling over their iPads. Then, his gaze locked onto the back corner booth. He saw a black man in a faded, oil-stained t-shirt, baggy cargo pants, and scuffed boots, typing on a high-end laptop. A man with a thick, untamed beard, looking completely out of place among the pristine, wealthy clientele of River Oaks. Lucas Hayes didn't notice the officer staring at him. He was deeply engrossed in drafting his operational summary, rubbing his tired eyes, his mind miles away. But Hayes's posture shifted. The casual, relaxed lean disappeared. He squared his shoulders, resting his right hand casually near his utility belt, letting his fingers brush the grip of his taser. He didn't see an exhausted man drinking coffee. Through the distorted, prejudiced lens of Mateo Hayes, he saw a suspect. He saw someone who didn't belong in this zip code. He saw an easy target to flex his authority on. Hayes grabbed his iced coffee from Chloe without a word of thanks. But instead of walking out the door to his cruiser, he turned on his heavy black boots and began a slow, deliberate march toward the back corner of the shop. The atmosphere in the café instantly shifted. The ambient chatter dialed down a fraction. People naturally sensed tension, and the predatory way Hayes was walking drew the eyes of several patrons. Lucas finally felt the shift in the room. His years of tactical training had honed his situational awareness to a razor's edge. Even exhausted, the primal alarm bells in the back of his mind began to ring. He briefly looked up from his screen, his dark eyes locking onto the approaching police officer. Lucas recognized the look on Hayes's face immediately. It was a look Lucas had spent his entire career, both as a black man in America and as a federal civil rights investigator, analyzing and dismantling. It was the look of unwarranted, aggressive entitlement. "Just drink your coffee, Lucas," he told himself. "Don't engage. Let him pass." But Officer Mateo Hayes wasn't going to pass. He stopped directly in front of Lucas's booth, towering over the table, deliberately invading Lucas's personal space. "Morning," Hayes said. The word was a greeting, but the tone was an accusation. Lucas took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee. He didn't close his laptop, but he lowered the screen just enough to signify he was listening, keeping his hands entirely visible on the table. It was a habit born of survival. "Good morning, officer," Lucas replied, his voice deep, gravelly from lack of sleep, and perfectly calm. Hayes looked down his nose at Lucas, his eyes darting between Lucas's face, the fading grease stain on his collar, and the sleek, expensive laptop on the table. It was a stark contrast that clearly bothered the officer. "You live around here?" Hayes asked, shifting his weight, his thumbs now hooked confidently into his duty belt. Lucas felt a familiar, cold spike of frustration in his chest. He knew exactly where this was going. It wasn't about public safety. It was about power. "No, I don't live in River Oaks," Lucas said plainly. "Just stopping in for a coffee." "Uh-huh," Hayes grunted, taking a loud slurp of his iced macchiato. "Just stopping in. You've been sitting here for a while, haven't you?" "About 15 minutes," Lucas replied, maintaining a steady, unblinking gaze. "Is there a time limit on drinking a large, dark roast?" Hayes's jaw tightened. He didn't like the pushback. He was used to civilians shrinking under his gaze, stammering out apologies, eager to appease the badge. Lucas's stoic, unbothered demeanor was infuriating to him. "We've had some issues in this neighborhood lately," Hayes said, leaning in slightly closer, his voice dropping an octave to maximize intimidation. "A string of residential burglaries, package thefts, people slipping in from outside the neighborhood, looking for easy targets. You match the description of a suspicious individual spotted lingering in the area." It was a textbook, boilerplate excuse, a lie spun out of thin air to justify an unconstitutional stop. Lucas knew the penal code and police procedure better than the man standing in front of him. "That's unfortunate," Lucas said smoothly. "I hope you catch who you're looking for. But I assure you, I'm just drinking my coffee." He reached out to raise his laptop screen again, a clear, non-verbal dismissal. Hayes slapped his palm down flat on the table. The sudden smack echoed through the quiet cafe. The businessman reading the newspaper jumped in his seat. Behind the counter, Chloe the barista stopped wiping down the espresso machine, her eyes wide with alarm. "I didn't say we were done talking," Hayes snapped, the polite veneer completely stripped away, revealing the ugly, aggressive core underneath. "I'm conducting an investigation. I need to see some ID." Lucas looked at the officer's hand on his table, then slowly dragged his eyes up to Hayes's flushed, angry face. "Officer," Lucas began, his tone dropping into a freezing, authoritative register. "I am sitting in a public place of business. I have purchased a beverage. I am not committing a crime, nor do you have reasonable, articulable suspicion to believe I am about to commit a crime. Therefore, under Texas law, I am not required to provide you with identification." Hayes blinked, momentarily taken aback. The legal jargon, delivered with absolute precision by a man he had profiled as a vagrant or a thug, short-circuited his brain for a second. But confusion quickly mutated into rage. "Listen to me, smart-ass," Hayes sneered, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. "I don't care what you think you know from watching Law and Order. You're loitering. You're refusing a lawful order. Now you're either going to hand over your driver's license, or I'm going to drag you out of this booth and throw you in the back of my cruiser for interfering with an investigation." At the counter, Chloe couldn't take it anymore. She was a young college student, inherently averse to conflict, but she recognized injustice when she saw it. "Excuse me, officer," Chloe called out, her voice trembling slightly. He's not loitering. He paid for his coffee. He's a customer." Hayes whipped his head around, pointing a thick, accusatory finger at the young woman. "Shut your mouth, kid. This is police business. Interfere again, and I'll cite you for obstruction." Chloe shrank back, clutching a damp rag to her chest, terrified. The rest of the cafe was dead silent. Every eye was glued to the corner booth. Some people looked appalled, but most looked down at their phones, desperately trying to avoid getting involved. Lucas's patience, worn thin by 2 weeks of undercover squalor, finally snapped. He wasn't just annoyed anymore. He was furious. He was furious for himself, furious for Chloe, who was just threatened for doing the right thing, and furious that men like Hayes wore a badge and terrorized citizens who didn't have the power to fight back. Lucas slowly closed his laptop. He pushed it to the side. "You're making a massive mistake, officer," Lucas said, his voice deadly quiet. It wasn't a threat of physical violence. It was a promise of absolute ruin. "I strongly suggest you step back, get your coffee, and walk out that door before you cross a line you cannot uncross." Hayes laughed, a harsh, barking sound devoid of any humor. "Are you threatening a police officer?" Hayes demanded, unbuckling the leather retention strap on his holster with a sharp snap. It was an escalation tactic, a deadly one. He was trying to provoke a reaction, looking for any excuse to escalate to physical violence. "Get up," Hayes ordered, his hand hovering over his Glock. "Get out of the booth, turn around, and put your hands flat on the brick wall." "Now." Lucas did not move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Hayes's hand, hovering near the firearm. The sheer arrogance of the situation was staggering. Hayes was ready to draw a weapon in a crowded coffee shop over a bruised ego and a racist assumption. "I am not standing up and I am not turning around," Lucas said, his voice radiating an icy calm that contrasted sharply with Hayes's hyper-aggressive panting. "Because if I stand up, you're going to use it as an excuse to put your hands on me. And if you put your hands on me, this situation is going to escalate in a way you are severely unprepared for. That's it. You're under arrest for resisting and criminal trespass," Hayes growled. He lunged forward, reaching across the table to grab Lucas by the collar of his faded t-shirt. Before Hayes's thick fingers could make contact, Lucas moved. His reaction was lightning fast, born of decades of tactical training. Lucas didn't strike the officer. Instead, his left hand shot up, catching Hayes's wrist mid-air in an iron grip. He didn't twist it or apply a lock. He just stopped the officer's forward momentum dead in its tracks. Hayes's eyes went wide. The physical strength behind Lucas's grip was startling. It wasn't the grip of a street thug. It was the controlled, unyielding grip of a highly trained operative. "Let go of me, you son of a—" "Look at my right hand," Lucas commanded. His voice cracked through the café like a whip. It was a voice used to commanding crime scenes, raiding compounds, and directing SWAT teams. Hayes froze, his eyes darting down. Lucas's right hand was slowly reaching inside the breast pocket of his heavy canvas jacket. "If you pull a weapon, I will drop you." Hayes panicked, his free hand instinctively dropping toward his holster. "I'm pulling my wallet, Matteo," Lucas said, reading the name tag pinned to Hayes's uniform. "Keep your hand off your gun. Just watch." Lucas slowly withdrew a sleek, black leather wallet. He didn't open it immediately. He let go of Hayes's wrist, smoothly pushing the officer's arm back. Hayes stumbled slightly, breathing heavily, caught completely off guard by the tactical discipline of the man sitting in front of him. With deliberate slowness, Lucas flipped the leather wallet open and tossed it onto the wooden table, right next to his coffee cup. It didn't land with the soft flutter of a driver's license. It hit the wood with a heavy metallic clack. Sitting perfectly illuminated under the cafe's recessed lighting was a solid gold shield, topped with an eagle. Next to it was a laminated ID card bearing Lucas's face, clean-shaven and wearing a sharp navy suit. Printed in bold, undeniable lettering were the words, "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Below that, Supervisory Special Agent Lucas Hayes. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the only sound in the coffee shop was the hum of the air conditioner and the hiss of the espresso machine. Hayes stared at the wallet. The blood drained from his ruddy face so fast he looked physically ill. The aggressive, domineering posture melted away, replaced by the hollow, trembling stance of a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. Lucas watched him, his eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "You wanted my identification, Officer Hayes," Lucas said softly in the deafening silence. "There it is. Supervisory Special Agent Hayes, Houston Field Office, currently acting as the lead investigator for the Public Corruption and Civil Rights Task Force." Hayes opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on a dock. His eyes darted from the gold badge to Lucas's face, finally seeing past the faded clothes and the beard, seeing the cold, unyielding authority radiating from the man. Agent Hayes," Hayes finally stammered, his voice cracking, completely unrecognizable from the booming bark he had used 30 seconds prior. He instinctively took a half-step backward, bumping into a nearby chair. I had no idea. You match the description of a— Stop talking, Lucas interrupted. It wasn't a yell. It was a command that left zero room for negotiation. Hayes snapped his mouth shut, swallowing hard. You didn't have a description? Lucas continued, leaning forward slightly, interlacing his fingers on the table. You walked in here. You saw a black man in clothes you deemed unworthy of this zip code, and you decided you were going to use your badge to humiliate me. You bypassed reasonable suspicion, you bypassed probable cause, and you went straight to threatening violence and false arrest. Sir, it's a misunderstanding. Hayes tried to backtrack, holding his hands up placatingly. The sweat on his forehead had nothing to do with the Houston heat. I'm just doing my job, protecting the community. If you had just told me you were on the job— If I wasn't on the job, what would you have done? Lucas cut him off, his voice rising just enough for the entire café to hear. If I was just a construction worker, or a plumber, or a guy who just got off a night shift, you would have dragged me out of here in cuffs. You threatened a young woman behind the counter for pointing out that I was a paying customer. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Badge number 492. Lucas read from Hayes's uniform. He dialed a number on his phone, keeping his eyes locked on the trembling officer. Agent Hayes, please, let's not blow this out of proportion, Hayes begged, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Cops got to look out for each other, right? I made a mistake. Let me buy your coffee. We can walk away from this. Lucas hit the speaker button on his phone and set it on the table next to his badge. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Internal Affairs Division, Captain Morales speaking. Hayes's knees practically buckled. Captain David Morales was the head of HPD's Internal Affairs, and a notoriously strict disciplinarian who actively collaborated with the FBI's corruption unit. Captain Morales, this is SSA, Lucas Hayes with the Bureau, Lucas said clearly, his eyes never leaving Hayes's pale, terrified face. Lucas, good to hear from you. Thought you were down in Galveston? What can I do for you? I just wrapped up in Galveston, David, but right now, I'm sitting at the grind and press on Westheimer, and I need you to dispatch a patrol supervisor down here immediately. Is everything okay? You need backup? No backup needed, Lucas replied coldly. But I have one of your patrol officers here, Officer Mateo Hayes, badge 4492. He just attempted to unlawfully detain me, threatened me with physical violence, and attempted an illegal search and seizure without probable cause. Hayes let out a pathetic, muffled groan, running a trembling hand over his buzzed head. He knew his career, his pension, and possibly his freedom were currently circling the drain. Officer Hayes, Morales repeated, his tone instantly shifting from friendly to purely professional. I am familiar with that name. I'm sending a sergeant and a lieutenant to your location right now. ETA is 5 minutes. Keep him there, Lucas. He's not going anywhere, Lucas said, hanging up the phone. Lucas leaned back in his leather booth, picked up his lukewarm coffee, and took a sip. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Have a seat, Mateo, Lucas said softly. We're going to have a long conversation about your career. The 5 minutes it took for the Houston Police Department supervisors to arrive felt like 5 hours to Officer Mateo Hayes. He had collapsed heavily into the wooden chair opposite Lucas Hayes, his knees practically giving out. The aggressive, chest-puffing predator from just moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by a deflated, hyperventilating shell of a man. His ruddy complexion had turned a sickly, ashen grey. Sweat beaded on his forehead, rolling down his temples and soaking the collar of his uniform shirt. Lucas did not look away. He sat perfectly still, his hands steepled on the table, watching the man disintegrate. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. The absolute absence of emotion on Lucas's face was far more terrifying to Hayes than anger would have been. It was the clinical, detached look of a surgeon examining a tumor right before excising it. Around them, the grind and press had transformed from a quiet morning refuge into a silent amphitheater. The patrons who had previously looked down at their phones to avoid eye contact were now holding those same phones up. The small red recording lights on half a dozen iPhones were pointed directly at the corner booth. Hayes noticed the cameras. His eyes darted around the room, panic flaring in his chest. "Agent Hayes, please," Hayes whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Tell them to put the phones away. This doesn't need to be on the internet. We can handle this in-house. Blue to blue." Lucas slowly lowered his coffee cup. "Blue to blue?" he repeated, his voice low but carrying a terrifying weight. "You think because I carry a badge, I'm going to cover for a man who uses his to terrorize the public? We are not on the same team, Matteo. I put people like you in federal prison for a living." Hayes swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I made a bad call. I thought you were a transient. You have to admit, you don't look like an FBI agent right now." "And what does an FBI agent look like, Matteo?" Lucas asked, leaning forward just an inch. "Do they look like the white businessman sitting at the counter? Or is it just that I look like the kind of man you're used to, throwing against a wall without consequences? You didn't stop me because I looked homeless. You stopped me because I am a black man sitting in a wealthy zip code, and you felt an overwhelming, arrogant need to remind me that you own the streets." "That's not true," Hayes lied weakly, his eyes darting to the floor. "I have reasonable suspicion. There were burglaries. We both know that's a lie," Lucas said smoothly. "And worst of all, you know I know it's a lie. I run the Public Corruption Task Force, Matteo. Do you know what that means? It means I spend my days reading internal affairs files of officers who pad their stats with unconstitutional Terry stops, officers who target minorities in affluent neighborhoods to appease wealthy donors, officers who have 3, 4, maybe 5 excessive force complaints that the union miraculously sweeps under the rug." Hayes flinched as if he had been physically struck. Lucas was bluffing about knowing Hayes's specific file. He hadn't read it yet, but based on the officer's reaction, the bluff had landed right on the money. "How many complaints are in your file, Matteo?" Lucas asked softly. Hayes didn't answer. He just stared at his black boots, his chest heaving. Suddenly, the heavy glass door of the café swung open. The bell chimed, slicing through the heavy tension in the room. 2 men in crisp Houston Police Department uniforms strode in. The first was Sergeant Paul Higgins, a tall, lean man with a tight jaw and a deeply lined face. Behind him was Lieutenant Gregory Stanton, a seasoned commander whose severe expression suggested he had zero tolerance for precinct drama. They bypassed the counter, their eyes sweeping the room before locking onto the corner booth. They saw Hayes, sitting slumped and defeated. And then they saw the man across from him, looking like a roughneck but radiating absolute command. Lieutenant Stanton approached the table. He looked at Hayes, then down at the table. His eyes locked onto the gold shield and the laminated FBI credentials resting next to the coffee cup. Stanton's posture stiffened immediately. He recognized the name on the ID. The Houston field office of the FBI wasn't that massive, and Supervisory Special Agent Hayes was well known among HPD top brass. He was highly respected, entirely uncompromising, and notoriously lethal to corrupt cops. "Agent Hayes," Lieutenant Stanton said, extending a hand. "Lieutenant Stanton, HPD Central Division. Captain Morales sent us over." "Are you all right, sir?" Lucas shook the lieutenant's hand, his grip firm. "I'm perfectly fine, Lieutenant. Thank you for getting here so quickly." Stanton turned his gaze to Hayes. The air temperature around the lieutenant seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Officer Hayes, stand up." Hayes scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking his chair over in the process. "Lieutenant, I can explain. This is a massive misunderstanding. I was conducting a proactive patrol and—" "Shut your mouth," Stanton barked, his voice cracking like a gunshot. The commanding tone silenced Hayes instantly. "Agent Hayes, can you walk me through exactly what happened here?" "Certainly," Lucas said. He remained seated, entirely calm, projecting the authority of the federal government in every syllable. "I was sitting here, off duty, completing a report on my laptop. Officer Hayes entered the establishment, procured a free beverage, and then bypassed several other patrons to approach me. He demanded my identification without articulating any reasonable suspicion of a crime. When I informed him of my rights under Texas law, he escalated. He threatened to drag me out of this booth, threatened me with false arrest for interfering with an investigation, and placed his hand on his service weapon in an attempt to intimidate me." Stanton's face tightened with every word. Threatening a federal agent was bad enough. Unlawfully detaining one under the color of law while resting a hand on a firearm was a career-ending catastrophe. "Is this true, Hayes?" Sergeant Higgins asked, stepping forward, his eyes burning with anger. "Did you threaten to pull you off your weapon on an unarmed man drinking coffee?" "He refused a lawful order," Hayes pleaded, his voice high-pitched and frantic. "He was being uncooperative. Look at him, Sarge. He looks like a vagrant. He's sitting in River Oaks with a $3,000 laptop. It looked suspicious. I was just trusting my instincts." It was the worst possible thing he could have said. The silence that followed Hayes's panicked defense was deafening. Even the patrons recording on their phones seemed to hold their breath. Lieutenant Stanton stared at Hayes, a look of profound disgust washing over his face. "So your instincts told you that a black man in work clothes couldn't possibly afford a nice computer unless he stole it?" Stanton asked, his voice deathly quiet. "That's your articulation for a Terry stop? That's your probable cause?" "No. I mean, there were burglaries reported." "Don't lie to me, Mateo," Stanton interrupted, stepping directly into Hayes's personal space. "There haven't been any residential burglaries in this grid in over 3 weeks. I review the morning reports. You profiled him. And when he knew his rights better than you did, your ego couldn't handle it, so you threatened him with violence." "Wait, there's more," a small, trembling voice called out. Everyone turned. Chloe, the young barista, had stepped out from behind the espresso counter. She was clutching her green apron with white knuckles, clearly terrified, but the sight of the HPD commanders and the FBI agent gave her the courage she needed. "Miss?" Sergeant Higgins asked gently, pulling a small notepad from his breast pocket. "Did you witness this altercation?" Chloe nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. The officer, he came in and demanded free coffee, which he always does. Then he went straight for that gentleman." She pointed at Lucas. "The customer wasn't doing anything. He was just typing. The officer got right in his face, slammed his hand on the table, and started screaming at him to show ID." She took a deep breath, her eyes darting to Hayes before looking back at the sergeant. "I tried to tell the officer that the man was a paying customer. And the officer turned around and pointed his finger at me. He told me to shut my mouth and threatened to arrest me for obstruction of justice if I spoke again." Stanton closed his eyes for a brief second, pinching the bridge of his nose. Threatening a federal agent was a federal crime. Threatening a civilian witness to cover up an unlawful detainment was entirely indefensible. "Thank you, miss. I will need to take a formal statement from you," Higgins said softly. "I have something else you might want, Lieutenant," A deep voice boomed from the back hallway of the café. Thomas Barrett, the owner of the Grind and Press, walked out, wiping his hands on a towel. He was a stern-looking man in his 50s who had been watching the entire scene unfold from his back office. "Mr. Barrett," Stanton acknowledged him. "I heard the commotion and pulled up the security feed," Barrett said, glaring at Hayes. "I have 4K high-definition cameras in here, Lieutenant. They record audio as well as video. I have the entire interaction, from the moment Officer Hayes walked through my door to the moment Agent Hayes put his badge on the table. You can clearly hear the officer threatening my barista and threatening to drag the agent out of the booth." Hayes's legs finally gave out. He slumped back against the brick wall, sliding down slightly until he caught himself on the edge of a table. The body cameras could be accidentally turned off. Police reports could be manipulated. But 4K civilian CCTV with audio was a death sentence. There was no spinning it. The Union couldn't save him from high-definition reality. Lucas finally stood up. Even in his faded clothes and scuffed boots, he commanded the room entirely. He walked around the table, standing shoulder to shoulder with Lieutenant Stanton. "Lieutenant," Lucas said, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet shop. "As of this moment, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is opening a preliminary inquiry into Officer Mateo Hayes under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Given his statements here today and his attempt to unlawfully detain and intimidate me, I believe he presents a clear and present danger to the civil rights of the citizens of Houston." Stanton nodded slowly. He didn't disagree. "I understand, Agent Hayes. HPD Internal Affairs will fully cooperate with your task force." Stanton turned to face Hayes, who was now staring blankly at the floor, breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. "Officer Hayes," Stanton said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You are officially relieved of duty, effective immediately, pending the outcome of both an internal affairs investigation and a federal civil rights inquiry." Hayes slowly looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with panicked tears. "Lou, please. My pension. My family. I've got 12 years on the force. You should have thought about your family before you decided to play cowboy and terrorize innocent people," Stanton replied coldly. "Hand over your weapon. Now." Hayes hesitated, his hand trembling as it hovered near his duty belt. "Do it, Mateo," Sergeant Higgins warned, resting his hand on his own sidearm. "Don't make this worse." With shaking hands, Hayes unclipped his radio, tossing it onto a nearby table. He unbuckled his heavy leather duty belt, the weight of the Glock, the taser, the handcuffs, and the spare magazines hitting the wooden table with a heavy, final thud. Lastly, he unpinned the silver Houston police badge from his chest, his fingers lingering on the metal for a second before he dropped it next to the gun. He was no longer a cop. In less than 20 minutes, he had gone from an untouchable apex predator to an unemployed, disgraced suspect facing federal prison time. "Sergeant Higgins, escort Mr. Hayes to your cruiser," Stanton ordered. "Put him in the back. Do not let him drive his own unit back to the precinct." "Yes, sir," Higgins said, stepping forward and grabbing Hayes firmly by the bicep. As Hayes was marched toward the front door, stripped of his weapons and his authority, the cafe remained dead silent. The patrons watched him go, their phone cameras capturing every humiliating second of his exit. As Hayes reached the glass door, he cast one final desperate look back at the corner booth. Lucas Hayes was already sitting back down. He didn't even look at the disgraced officer. He simply picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and opened his laptop back up to finish his report. The bully had been broken, and for Lucas, it was just another Tuesday. By noon that same Tuesday, the cell phone footage recorded by the patrons of the Grind and Press had hit the internet. By 3 p.m., It was the top trending video nationwide. The internet dubbed it the River Oaks reality check, and the public reaction was an absolute firestorm. For years, Mateo Hayes had operated in the shadows of bureaucratic protection. When he harassed a teenager or illegally searched a motorist, it was always his word against theirs. But now, his arrogance was broadcast in high-definition 4K from the coffee shop's security feed, seamlessly stitched together with half a dozen different smartphone angles. Every news network in the country was looping the exact moment Lucas Hayes's solid gold federal shield hit the wooden table, followed by the undeniable, visceral terror draining the color from Officer Hayes's face. Hayes, sitting in his modest suburban home on unpaid administrative leave, watched his life implode on a 55-inch flat screen. His phone hadn't stopped ringing, but it wasn't his colleagues calling to offer support. It was reporters, investigative journalists, and angry citizens who had managed to find his unlisted number. He still held on to a thin, desperate shred of hope. He had the Houston Police Officers Union. The union was a powerful political machine, and its president, a bulldog of a man named Jack Callahan, was legendary for protecting cops from termination, regardless of the offense. Hayes believed that if he kept his mouth shut, the union lawyers would spin the narrative, cite officer safety and high-stress decision-making, and eventually secure him a quiet resignation where he could keep his 12-year pension. But Hayes didn't understand the magnitude of the enemy he had made. Downtown, inside the fortress-like walls of the FBI's Houston field office, Supervisory Special Agent Lucas Hayes was no longer wearing faded cargo pants and scuffed boots. He was back in his armor, a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep burgundy tie. He stood at the head of a long mahogany conference table, flanked by a team of federal prosecutors and civil rights investigators. Spread out across the table was Mateo Hayes's entire internal affairs file. It was a massive, sprawling document, thicker than a city phone book. "Look at this pattern," Lucas said, his voice a low, commanding rumble as he tapped a stack of papers. 14 complaints in 12 years, 7 for excessive use of force, 5 for unlawful detainment and racial profiling, every single one of them buried by the union or dismissed as inconclusive by precinct captains who didn't want the bad PR. A young federal prosecutor, David Harasses, adjusted his glasses. "The local district attorney usually won't touch these cases, Lucas. They rely on HPD for their own convictions. They don't want to bite the hand that feeds them." "That's exactly why the Bureau is taking jurisdiction," Lucas replied coldly. "Hayes didn't just break department policy, he violated federal law. He attempted to deprive a citizen of their constitutional rights under the color of law, using the threat of a deadly weapon to enforce his bruised ego. We are moving forward with a federal indictment under Title 18, USC Section 242. And we are going to use his body camera footage to nail the coffin shut." The true twist in the case, the fatal error that Hayes had completely forgotten in his panic, was his own Axon body camera. While Hayes had aggressively approached Lucas in the coffee shop, he hadn't formally activated the camera's recording feature. However, modern police body cameras have a 30-second pre-event buffering system. When Hayes's sergeant had arrived and triggered the system, the camera pulled the audio and video from the minutes prior to the confrontation. Lucas clicked a remote, and the projector at the end of the room lit up. The audio filled the room. It was Hayes, sitting in his cruiser right before he walked into the grind and press. He was on the phone with an unidentified colleague. "Yeah, I'm pulling up to the coffee shop now," Hayes's voice sneered through the speakers. "Gotta get my caffeine. Wait, hold on. There's some thug sitting in the back booth. Looks like he crawled out of a dumpster. Probably casing the parking lot for an easy grab. I'm going to go in there, rattle his cage, and run him out of this zip code. These people need to learn they can't just loiter wherever they want." Lucas paused the recording. The silence in the conference room was absolute. "He declared his intent," Lucas said, his eyes scanning the room. "It wasn't a proactive patrol. It wasn't an investigation into neighborhood burglaries. It was a premeditated, racially motivated harassment campaign." He admitted it on tape. The next morning, Jack Callahan, the union president, sat in a windowless room with Hayes and a high-priced defense attorney. Callahan slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "What's this?" Hayes asked, his voice shaking. "That is a copy of your federal indictment," Callahan said, his voice devoid of its usual bluster. He looked at Hayes not with solidarity, but with utter disdain. "The Department of Justice is bringing the hammer down. They've got the coffee shop 4K video, they've got the barista's testimony, and they pulled your pre-buffer body cam audio, where you used a racial dog whistle before you even stepped out of your cruiser." You have to fight this, Jack," Hayes pleaded, slamming his hands on the table. "You're the union. You protect us. I protect cops who make honest mistakes in the line of duty," Callahan growled, leaning forward until he was inches from Hayes's face. "I don't protect rogue liabilities who threaten federal agents and give the DOJ an excuse to audit this entire department. The FBI made it clear, if we try to shield you, they will open a sweeping federal probe into our entire precinct's arrest records for the last 10 years. You're radioactive, Mateo. The union is officially withdrawing its legal representation." Hayes felt the air leave his lungs. He was entirely alone. But karma wasn't done with him yet. The viral nature of the video had an unintended ripple effect. Seeing Hayes utterly humiliated and exposed on national television broke the dam of fear that had kept his past victims silent. Within 48 hours of the video going viral, 5 different citizens came forward to the FBI. One was a young software engineer named Daniel Foster, whom Hayes had violently pinned to the hood of a car for looking suspicious while jogging in his own neighborhood. Another was a single mother whom Hayes had threatened with child protective services during a routine traffic stop to extort a vehicle search. They all had one thing in common. They saw Lucas Hayes stand his ground, and they realized that Mateo Hayes was not a god. He was just a bully with a piece of metal on his chest. And bullies bleed when you punch them in the mouth with the law. 4 months later, the circus culminated in the towering, brutalist architecture of the Bob Casey United States Courthouse in downtown Houston. The courtroom of the Honorable Federal Judge Harrison Caldwell was packed to maximum capacity. The gallery was filled with civil rights activists, local journalists, and the citizens Hayes had terrorized over his 12-year career. Sitting in the front row, looking nervous but deeply vindicated, was Chloe the barista, flanked by her boss, Mr. Barrett. At the prosecution table sat Lucas Hayes. He was perfectly still, his posture radiating the same icy, unyielding calm he had displayed in the coffee shop booth. At the defense table sat Mateo Hayes. The transformation was jarring. The stocky, aggressive fire hydrant of a man had withered. He had lost 20 pounds. His ruddy complexion was pale and sickly. Stripped of his uniform, his gun, and his badge, he looked exceptionally small in his oversized, cheap grey suit. He kept his eyes glued to the hardwood floor, unable to meet the gaze of the people in the gallery. Hayes had known he couldn't win a trial. The evidence was insurmountable. His public defender had negotiated a plea deal, hoping to avoid the maximum statutory penalty. Judge Caldwell, an older, stern-faced jurist known for his absolute intolerance of public corruption, peered over his reading glasses at the disgraced officer. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Caldwell's voice echoed through the cavernous room, heavy with contempt. You have pleaded guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony. Before I pass sentence, is there anything you wish to say?" Hayes slowly stood up on trembling legs. He clutched the edges of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked toward the gallery, then toward Lucas. I just want to apologize," Hayes mumbled, his voice cracking. "I lost my temper. I made a terrible error in judgment. I let the stress of the job get to me, and I deeply regret my actions." It was a hollow, textbook non-apology. It was the rehearsed speech of a man who was sorry he got caught, not sorry for what he did. Judge Caldwell was not impressed. He slammed his folder shut. "An error in judgment is misreading a penal code, Mr. Hayes," the judge boomed. "What you did was an active, deliberate abuse of power. You targeted a citizen based on your own prejudiced assumptions. You attempted to use the authority granted to you by the state of Texas as a weapon of intimidation. You threatened a young woman who dared to speak the truth, and you did it all under the arrogant assumption that your badge made you untouchable." The courtroom was dead silent. Every word from the judge landed like a physical blow on Hayes's shoulders. "The true tragedy of this case is not that you targeted an undercover federal agent," Caldwell continued, his eyes narrowing. "The tragedy is that if Agent Hayes had been exactly who you thought he was, a working-class man trying to enjoy a cup of coffee, you would have succeeded. You would have arrested him, ruined his life, and padded your statistics, and this court would have never been the wiser. Agent Hayes did not just defend himself that day. He defended every citizen you have ever unlawfully harassed." Judge Caldwell picked up his gavel. "Mateo Hayes, it is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve a term of 48 months. Upon your release, you will serve 3 years of supervised probation. Furthermore, you are forever stripped of your law enforcement certification, and you forfeit your municipal pension in its entirety." Hayes let out a choked, wet gasp. His knees buckled, and his public defender had to grab his arm to keep him from collapsing completely. 4 years in a federal penitentiary. No pension. No future. Absolute ruin. "Court is adjourned," Caldwell declared, bringing the gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. 2 United States Marshals immediately stepped forward. They didn't ask Hayes to turn around. They grabbed him by the arms, spun him around roughly, and pulled his arms behind his back. The sound of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting, closed around Hayes's wrists, was the sweetest sound the gallery had ever heard. As Hayes was marched down the center aisle toward the holding cells, he passed the prosecution table. Lucas Hayes finally looked at him. Lucas didn't smile. He didn't offer a witty parting remark. He simply gave Hayes a slow, knowing nod. A silent acknowledgement that the scales of justice had finally been balanced. Hayes looked away, tears streaming down his face, completely broken. Later that afternoon, the suffocating Houston heat was still beating down on the pavement as Lucas walked out of the federal courthouse. He loosened his burgundy tie and took a deep breath of the humid air. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his unit chief. "Excellent work today, Lucas," the chief said. "The director is thrilled. We've got a new assignment for you. Joint operation out in El Paso, going after a ring of corrupt border inspectors. You up for it?" Lucas looked back at the courthouse, then out at the sprawling, chaotic city he had sworn an oath to protect. There were always more bullies. There was always more corruption. "I'll pack my bags, Chief," Lucas replied, a faint, determined smile touching his lips. "I'm ready." He walked toward his unmarked Tahoe, ready to slip back into the shadows. The predator had been caged, the streets were a little bit safer, and Lucas Hayes was just getting started. Karma doesn't always act fast, but when it does, It strikes with devastating precision. Officer Hayes thought his badge was a shield for his bigotry, but he picked the absolute worst target to bully. True power isn't loud or abusive. It's quiet, composed, and ready to hold corruption accountable. If you loved hearing this bully get beautifully put in his place, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story to spread the message that nobody is above the law, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life justice stories.